Dr. Martyn Lloyd-Jones needs no introduction from me, and he has already given his first exposition yesterday evening on the wonderful works of God, reminding us that God is active and concerned in the affairs of men and intervenes in history and in his church. He is to give us the second of these talks now on the supernatural in relation to the practice of medicine, and I'm not going to take any more of his time and yours, but ask him to speak to us. Dr. Martyn Lloyd-Jones.
The title for this morning's address is somewhat pretentious, and I hope it hasn't misled anybody. I've always had a kind of constitutional difficulty about choosing titles for sermons or for addresses. In fact, I've never been able to do it. And this present title is the result mainly of the ingenuity of the General Secretary, who thought that this would give me a right to do almost anything I chose. And not for the first time, I'm extremely grateful to him. What I really want to try to do is this. I feel that the time has come when we should reconsider some of our established attitudes towards elements in life and practice, both of the Christian in general and of the medical Christian in particular, where certain difficulties arise. And I want in particular to have another look with you at the whole question of what is called faith healing, or if you like, miraculous healing. Now, the title allows me to do more than that, but I don't think in one session that one can do more than that. Let me try and paint in the background and tell you why I'm doing this. Everybody here, I'm quite sure, is constantly questioned on this matter, whether by a patient or a relative or somebody else. Someone's desperately ill, and medical science, art, or whatever you may call it, has done its utmost, but the patient's getting worse. And somebody suggests the possibility of faith healing, and so you're confronted by the problem. I've been struggling with this problem for many, many years. I suppose that of all the questions put to me from time to time, none has been put more frequently than this. I was suddenly confronted by it in an acute form back in 1928. I'd been just about 12 months in the Christian ministry, that's to say the minister of a church, and I'd gone to preach in a place in the Vale of Glamorgan. And having preached, I was approached at the close of the service by two local ministers who asked me if I'd be prepared to go down there to chair and to conduct a conference on the question of faith healing. Well, I was rather surprised at the request, coming as it did in the heart of an agricultural community, where you don't normally get this kind of question. So I asked them why they were interested in this subject. And they said it was quite simple, that a Pentecostal pastor had been there not long before conducting a 10-day mission. And they decided that they'd support him, and they had done so. And they had found that there had been 66 converts as the result of the 10-day mission. They then went on to say that they were quite clear in their minds that the converts were not due to the preaching. Well, what were they due to, I said? Well, they said they were due to the healings. A number of people had been healed in the meetings, and so they attributed the 66 converts to this. Well, they were not believers in faith healing, but they'd been impressed by this and wondered whether perhaps there was not something defective in their theological outlook. So they wanted this conference, and rather reluctantly I consented to do this. For some peculiar reason, I forgot all about this, and I didn't hear from them, so the thing went right out of my mind, until about 9 months later I got another request to preach in this place, and I went, and as I was traveling in the train, all this came back to me, and I was a little bit fearful as to what kind of reception I'd get, especially from these two men. However, I eyed the congregation and saw my two brethren, and they seemed to look quite normal and as usual. And to my surprise, they came forward to speak to me at the end. And I said, well, I'm convinced of the fact that you are two good Christian men. And they said, why do you say that? I said, well, you evidently have the grace of forgiveness. What do you mean, they said. And I said, well, you remember you asked me to come and take a conference on faith healing, and I haven't been. And they smiled. I said, what's the matter? They said, oh, we're no longer interested in faith healing. Why not? I said. Well, they said, not one of the people healed remained healed, and not one of the 66 converts stood. So they were no longer interested in faith healing. And I must confess that I rather felt that this had settled the question, solved the problem. Nothing in it. The whole thing is spurious. However, it didn't finish it as far as I was concerned, and I've been constantly face to face with this particular question and problem. But I feel that recently, say within the last few years, the matter has become much more acute. One's been struggling with it all through the years, but I think there are certain new factors which have compelled me, at any rate, to rethink this whole matter, and I'm putting my thoughts before you for what they're worth. There is, as I was saying in passing last night, a new interest in phenomena. Then there is this so-called charismatic movement, and there's a good deal of talk about healing in connection with this, apart from certain other manifestations. There is no question at all of a great recrudescence of what one must call demon possession. Now, I was in a meeting of ministers last Monday, and I was astonished at the number of men who got up to report what I would have to accept as genuine cases of this. And I've met it in other ways also. And it's become a very acute question for many ministers as to how you draw the line between a mental illness and a demon possession, and how you handle them, and so on. Some of you may have read a booklet issued by the Overseas Missionary Fellowship under the title of Roaring Lion, which deals specifically with this question of demon possession, and which I regard as an excellent book. And I believe it's true to say that Nevius's famous book on demon possession is about to be reprinted after being out of print for a number of years. All this is indicative of this new interest in all this. Well, then some of you may have read a book by a German called Kurt Koch on the revival in Indonesia, where a number of cases of healing, miraculous healing, are recorded. And Kurt Koch is a man, a balanced man, a well-taught man, a good theologian, a man who has a good mind, a man who's very careful in his statements. In fact, one tends to feel at times that he's almost overcautious. His big book, Christian Counseling and the Occult, for instance, shows a great wariness in accepting statements of fact. He scrutinizes them and tests them and examines them. But here is this man making this report of what he has seen on 2 visits to Indonesia, where they've experienced a remarkable revival in these last 5 or 6 years. But what really has precipitated the whole thing, as far as I'm concerned personally, was an experience I had in America 2 years ago. I was there for about 5 months. First, I was asked by members of the faculty of the Westminster Theological Seminary, where they tend to be intellectual and skeptical of anything approaching enthusiasm. But I was asked by these friends, what did I think of faith healing, and in particular the activities of a lady of the name of Catherine Kuhlman. Well, as it happened, I'd read the book by Catherine Kuhlman, which bears the title, I Believe in Miracles. But I was interested to know why they were concerned about this, and this was the answer I got. A very well-known American preacher, Dr. Harold Ockenga, had invited Mrs. Catherine Kuhlman to take meetings in his church in Boston. And as a result of the fact that it was Dr. Ockenga who had invited her, the daughter of one of the members of the faculty of Westminster Seminary had gone with a friend to the meeting. And they had gone in a very critical mood, but they'd come away enthusiastic, greatly impressed. and had written home about this. And so the problem had been landed on the plate of these members of the faculty at Westminster. And there was great discussion going on about all this. How did we assess it? What did we make of it? Well, then going down to Cincinnati, I came up against the same problem again. They have an annual convention in Cincinnati of evangelical people. And amongst the speakers, a minister, a well-known minister from Pittsburgh, had been invited for the following October. And all was well until somebody heard that this man was giving the loan of his church premises to Catherine Kuhlman for her meetings of healing and of biblical instruction. And this raised an acute problem in the executive council of this convention. And I was called in as a consultant, the only respect in which I am called in such a capacity these days. There was a real division amongst them as to whether this man should be allowed to speak at the convention in view of his sponsoring of these healing meetings of Catherine Kuhlman. So I had to face it all anew and afresh. And I'm going to try to give this morning the outcome of my meditations and thinking during that period and since. Now, I believe I'm right in saying that there are two main positions with regard to this whole subject amongst Christian people. The first is those who capitulate to phenomena. I put it in that way quite deliberately. Now, this minister in Pittsburgh, I think, was an example of this. I'm not betraying any confidence because the man does this in public and he's spoken about it in public. He's a man of the name of Lamont, Dr. Lamont, and one of the leading preachers of the United Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, a man of standing and of judgment. He sponsors these meetings of Catherine Kuhlman, and he gives his reason for doing so, and this is his reason. He says, we have all been doing our best for years, but nothing much seems to happen. And he says, I have a great fear that we who belong to the older denominations are going to be bypassed. Things are happening. People are being aroused and moved, and people from the world are being drawn in by people such as Catherine Kuhlman and others. And he had become fearful, lest they were in their entrenched positions missing some remarkable work that God is doing. And the result was that he had more or less abandoned his old positions and in an entirely uncritical manner had said, well, we must go into this. We must see what it is. Whatever we may have believed, we must be prepared to re-examine everything. And it seemed to me that he and others with him, because there were other men representative of this same point of view at Cincinnati, they were virtually saying, well, theology doesn't matter as long as you see this kind of thing happening. Now, this, of course, is something which is manifesting itself in another way in connection with this charismatic movement. Not so much over healing as over tongues and so on. It's showing itself in this way. The Roman Catholics are becoming involved in this movement, and very much so in the United States and in Southern America, in many of the countries. Some of you may have read a book that's come out recently called Catholic Pentecostalism. I think this is a book that's going to make us all think, and we'll have to think very urgently. I believe it has very dangerous elements in it, for this reason, that the main thesis seems to be this, that theology doesn't matter, that what really matters is that one has had this living experience of the Spirit which manifests itself in particular gifts. So you can more or less believe anything you like, as long as you have these manifestations. So I put all this under this kind of general heading of a kind of capitulation to phenomena, that your theology and your views and your doctrine are more or less determined by phenomena. Now that's one big group. The other group, of course, consists of those who tend to reject the whole of this in toto. and feel that it really doesn't merit much discussion, that we've been hearing about this throughout the years, and that the less we have to do with it, the better. Now, I want to examine these two positions, and we'll start perhaps with the second. Those who reject the whole thing do so, I find, on the whole, for three main reasons. Well, the first is not a reason, but it's a statement of fact. They just refuse to consider it at all. The entire thing is dismissed. It's dismissed as being psychological, or something perhaps even worse, but generally psychological. And it's done so in terms of the kind of people who practice this. For instance, I met people who said, well, there you are. They say, what more do you want? Here it is, Catherine Kuhlman, a woman preacher. There was no need to say any more. And then they would recount certain aberrations amongst the Pentecostals and things of that kind. And then I've often had this argument. Take the famous business at Lourdes amongst the Roman Catholics. They won't consider any possibility of facts. Why? Well, because of the very origin of Lourdes. This simple girl, slightly under normal, who claims to have had a vision of the Virgin Mary. There's no need to go any further. There's nothing in it. The whole thing is wrong. And though they may make claims, they can't be true. It's impossible. You just dismiss it on these general grounds of either the people who practice it or the origin of the movement or whatever it is. But then there are others who reject it all on what they would call scientific grounds. They say the laws of nature make this quite impossible, that nature is a closed system, that nature is a matter of cause and effect. And because of this, miracles are impossible. Now, this is the old liberal attitude towards miracles, of course. You remember how Matthew Arnold put it so clearly. Miracles cannot happen, therefore miracles don't happen and haven't happened. And it's quite logical. If they can't, well, they haven't. And there's no more to be said. But I have known, I think, many people amongst ourselves as evangelicals who have adopted that kind of scientific attitude, which rules out the possibility of the miraculous because of their view of nature and the laws of nature. And then there is a third group which I put under the heading of biblical. And they really pay very little attention to all these claims because they hold dogmatically the view that the miraculous and all such spiritual manifestations ended with the apostles, and that once we were given the scriptures, the canon of the New Testament, that all this came to an end. This, I think, has been a very common view, and a common view amongst us. They try to argue the case in terms of their exposition of the 13th chapter of the first epistle to the Corinthians, about these things passing away when knowledge comes, and knowledge there means, they say, the giving of the scriptures, and so on. And under this same general biblical heading, I would put the attitude which has been put forward perhaps most clearly in that book by that man called Keller, in which an attempt is made to explain what have been accepted in the past as miracles. Many of you may have read that book. It came out a number of years back. I remember one instance to give you a specimen of his kind of teaching. You remember the incident of Moses striking the rock and the water gushing forth. Well, now, the explanation which we are given is this, that during the last war, some British soldiers were having to make a new road, and there they were with their picks and their shovels making this new road. And one of these soldiers, in using his pick, it happened to go back a little bit further than he'd intended, and it touched the rock that was behind him. And the moment it did so, there was a little trickle of water. So, you see, it was something like this that Moses did. This sort of thing does happen, And so you were given what is purported to be an explanation of the miracle. In other words, it wasn't a miracle at all. Now, these are some of the ways in which people have rejected this whole notion of the miraculous, the possibility of a miraculous healing at the present time. And this is what I think needs reconsideration. And I would put it to you in this form, that first of all we must again face the question of facts. It is surely unscientific to reject facts. It is no part of our business to reject facts, and I think we've got to face this anew and afresh. Take the case of this Catherine Kuhlman. She's been a minister of a Baptist church in Pittsburgh, I think now for over 20 years, and is very well known to a man like this Dr. Lamont, and two medical men were elders in Dr. Lamont's church, and with whom, one of whom at any rate one was able to speak. These are not wild enthusiasts, but balanced, sane, well, as I've said, two Presbyterian elders. Perhaps no more needs to be said. Not some strange English sect, but good, solid Presbyterians. And these men, I'm not talking about their views so much now as their attestation of facts, where they claim that people with organic diseases, in their knowledge, have been cured, and that it was this that has won them over to support Dr. Catherine Kuhlman. And in her second book, which came out, I think, within the last 2 years, and which I've also read, there are cases certified by medical men, and you have their names and degrees and hospitals to which they belong, and so on and so forth. Indeed, 1 or 2 of the cases happen to be medical men themselves. Well, now, I frankly am in this position. I cannot say that these people are liars. Neither can I say that they're deluded. Everything that one knows about these people or can discover about them suggests that they're reliable witnesses and that they have no reason for reporting these facts or supporting them, save that they are facts and that they feel in honor and duty bound to say so. And then we have the case of Harry Roberts, the spiritist in this country. I don't happen to agree with Dr. Leslie Weatherhead in theology, but I'm prepared to accept certain statements of fact. And he has said quite definitely that he personally, having watched Harry Roberts for a number of days and examined cases, is quite satisfied that in there again there were organic diseases that were healed. But for myself, the thing that has impressed me most throughout the years was a little booklet I read a number of years ago by Alexis Carrel. The older people here will remember, I'm sure, the Carrel-Daking solution, which we used to have to use in the surgery immediately after the First World War, with cuts and wounds and things of that description. One was familiar, therefore, with the name of Alexis Carrel. Now, Alexis Carrel wrote a little booklet on this subject, in which he gives an account of something that happened in his own experience. He's a Roman Catholic, but not a practicing one. However, he had become interested in this whole business of Lourdes and had decided to go and investigate it for himself. And in this booklet, he gives an account of traveling down on the train, and there was a case of miliary tuberculosis. It had started as a sort of intestinal tuberculosis, but it had reached this miliary stage. He describes the distended abdomen and so on. He examined the patient on the train and felt the patient was in extremis. He was doubtful whether the patient would even reach Lourdes. However, the next day he saw with his own eyes the cure of this person. He saw this distended abdomen gradually receding and going down, and he was able to examine the patient subsequently and could find no evidence of any disease whatsoever. He then went, of course, to the medical bureau that they have at Lourdes, and which they've had for a number of years, with x-rays and everything that can be desired. And he, without coming to any conclusions, just stated this as a fact. And I'm arguing that if we just say we don't believe it, that we're adopting an unscientific attitude. We've got to face facts. Whether they fit in with our theories or not is another matter. It is very wrong from every reason to reject facts. But still more interesting, it seems to me, is the extraordinary change that has been taking place in the realm of scientific thinking in these last years. I know of nothing that's more interesting and more important than this. I don't pretend to understand it all, but I understand enough to be able to follow the argument and the reasoning. The scientific view of the 19th century has been abandoned. It's no longer held. Now, that was a view which taught us that natural laws, or the laws of nature, governed all events, cause and effect, laws of nature. And everything was governed by this. They talked of every event having this kind of explanation. It was deterministic, and it was mechanistic and static in its outlook. And of course it was the controlling scientific theory. It had come from Descartes and from Isaac Newton. They were the fathers of this, and it was universally adopted. And I think that most of us trained in that tradition had virtually accepted this, and that this was the only truly scientific attitude. But the fact is that as the result of the work of Einstein, his theory of relativity, and the quantum theory, and so on, there is an entirely new approach. And what scientists, the best scientists, are now saying is this, that our knowledge of the laws of nature, so-called, is very limited. Our so-called laws of nature only describe a part of actuality and of the phenomena. As far as they go, they're correct, but all they do is to describe certain common patterns. It isn't that they're disputing these patterns, and that within the realm of these patterns you can still talk of cause and effect. But what they've discovered is that there are other factors outside these patterns which cannot be explained in terms of our established or recognized laws of nature. In other words, they are realizing that there are limits in the observer, and that there is so much more in the cosmos than the scientists dogmatically assumed, especially during the last century. So that there is a new kind of humility, and all this business about DNA and RNA has greatly accelerated this new view of science. In other words, the modern idea is indeterminacy, not determinacy, but indeterminacy. They talk now about probability, not certainty. There is a new kind of openness. One of them I was reading recently didn't hesitate to use the phrase that the laws of nature, as we've called them, are actually changing, that the rate at which light travels is changing, and the rate at which certain other phenomena come to pass is actually changing. So that with this new view of science, you no longer teach that the laws of nature govern events. This view of energy, and especially electrical energy and so on, is such that you must only talk about probabilities. And there are all sorts of possibilities. And we have no right to be dogmatic and to lay it down that you always have cause and effect. Now, this can be worked out, of course, in many, many ways. It's, to me, most encouraging that there is this change, because on the other view, in the end, there was no purpose in holding any view whatsoever, because even one's thinking was the result of some cause leading to an effect. The whole thing was mechanistic, and what a man happened to believe was the result of some forces outside his own control. There was no volition, and so on. And ultimately, of course, it did lead to an exclusion even of God. If nature is this closed system, well, there's no need of God, and most of these people didn't believe in God at all. However, we are concerned about it more as it affects our particular realm. Well, now then, there is this changed attitude in the realm of scientists, not Christians who are scientists or scientists who are Christian, but men who are primarily and essentially science men. And there is this remarkable change in their attitude. There is this openness and the recognition of possibilities outside what we have hitherto regarded as being this closed system. When you come to the biblical rejection, or rejection of these facts and phenomena in terms of supposed biblical teaching, I personally have always found myself quite unable to accept the well-known teaching that everything belonging to the realm of the miraculous and the supernatural as manifested in New Testament times came to an end with the apostolic age. There is no statement in the Scripture which says that, none at all. There is no specific or even indirect statement to that effect. I believe that interpretation of 1 Corinthians 13 is quite wrong. That refers to the future state. To say that when the Scriptures, when we had the New Testament canon established, that we have all knowledge and now know even as we are known, is to me quite ridiculous. It's not an explanation. The whole purpose and point of that argument is to contrast this present with our future state of existence. And I likewise am not satisfied by Warfield's answer to those who have claimed that miracles did continue after the apostolic age. It's well known that Tertullian and Augustine both made use of the argument of miracles happening in their time and in their age in defense and as a part of their apologetic for the Christian faith. And I've never been satisfied with Warfield's answer to that. Amongst themselves, scholars are not agreed about this, that you can dismiss the whole thing. Not only that, as one who has been very interested in the history of the Scottish Covenanters and the Scottish early reformers, I've always been deeply impressed by evidence that comes from those times. There are incidents reported in the life of John Welsh, who was the son-in-law of John Knox, where it seems perfectly clear that there were miracles performed in certain strange, extreme circumstances. There's the famous Covenanter Alexander Peden. It seems to me to be beyond any dispute that that man had the power of foreknowledge and did prophesy things that subsequently came to pass. The records are quite authentic, and they can be read in two great volumes that deal with that kind of history. So that I've never been happy about this supposed biblical exclusion of the possibility of miracles. The teaching has been, you see, that as all this ended with the apostles, whatever claims to be miraculous now must of necessity be spurious, either exaggerated or a lie and so on and so forth. It can't happen. It can't happen because all this did end with the apostles. Now, to me, this is extremely dangerous because it means that you're forming a kind of new dispensationalism. What parts of the Scripture apply to us? Does James 5 speak to us or doesn't it? It's clear that most of 1 Corinthians has nothing to say to us at all. In other words, I believe we've been guilty unconsciously of introducing a new kind of deism. We've excluded God. We said this can't happen because this ended at the time of the apostles. Surely this is a position we're not entitled to adopt. We can't support it. We're making a dogmatic statement. It seems to solve our problems. We can dismiss things we are told, and it makes us feel happy. But is it right? I'm suggesting that the time has come when we've got to re-examine all this, lest we find ourselves advocating this kind of deism. And then particularly so in the light of certain statements that are found in the Scriptures. Now, I haven't all of a sudden changed my prophetic views. I've been an amillennialist throughout the years, and I'm still extremely skeptical about these people, you know, who, like the young man I once met in a train. I was going to preach, I think it was in Bath, and on an Easter Monday, and at Reading, a young man came into my compartment with a Bible and a copy of the Times in his hand. And I knew exactly what he was and what he was going to do. He was going to a prophetic meeting, and he was. We entered into conversation. The Times and the Bible, you see. And the Bible is expounded by the Times. It was all there. Times and seasons could all be worked out. Well, now, I haven't suddenly decamped and joined that company. But when one sees Matthew 24:24, for instance, where one reads, "For there shall arise false prophets, false Christs, and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect," one's compelled to think. This deals with the last times, the end of the present age. I'm not suggesting that we're there. We may be, I don't know. But all I am suggesting is this, that when that time does come, there are going to be these signs, these wonderful signs, these wonders and signs, and they'll be so remarkable, so much as almost to deceive the very elect. In other words, phenomena are going to take place. There will be supernatural events. Well, if we decide beforehand that there cannot be anything of the kind, how are we going to find ourselves placed when this kind of thing happens, if we should still be on earth when it does happen? It seems to me, for all these reasons, that it is very wrong of us on any dogmatic grounds to dismiss the whole of what is claimed in this respect. And on top of all that, I would suggest this, that in the Bible itself there is discernible, surely, a kind of periodicity in the appearance of these supernatural happenings. For instance, there's clearly a periodicity in the Old Testament itself. These things happened at special given times, and for clear and obvious reasons. And I think the same is seen in a measure in the New Testament. And we are told that the Spirit is the Lord of these matters. So that, therefore, this is something that can happen at any time when it is the will of God that it should happen. And who are we to determine when this is to happen? Now, it seems quite clear that, taking the Christian era in general, that there was a profusion in the matter of such events at the very beginning, which has not continued. As I've said, I'm not satisfied that it's never happened since. But speaking generally, it has tended not to happen, and that when you've had the great kind of revivals to which I was referring last night, the phenomena consisted not so much in the working of miracles or healings or any spiritual gifts, as extraordinary power of preaching and extraordinary depth of conviction and an unusual element of joy and of exhilaration. Well, that is, it seems to me, within the lordship of the Spirit. And the fact that it has generally been that in our Christian era is no proof that at any given point there may not be a reintroduction of these kind of phenomena, and especially as one is approaching the end of the age. And in addition to this, those who've been interested in reading things like the life of Pastor Shi of China and so on, have come across incidents and events which I, at any rate, could not explain except in terms of the supernatural and the miraculous. Very well. There then is a kind of general review of this negative attitude towards the claims that are being made. I'm still dealing with those who reject it. I'm not considering at the moment the case of those who become credulous and are so impressed by the phenomena that they capitulate to it. But now, in addition to all these general remarks, I believe there are certain other facts to which we have not given the weight that should be attached to them. There are certain medical facts, it seems to me, that we have tended to discount. And I'm referring now to the reports of spontaneous cures, and particularly in the matter of cancer. I had the pleasure of meeting a man in Cincinnati who was a research medical man, and he'd been working in Chicago with two others, and these other two had collected 244 cases in the medical literature in the United States of spontaneous cures of cancer. And he was able to show me one of their articles in which this was reported. And you were familiar with the kind of argument. I remember when the Skemp, as it's called, was looking into this matter, we came across some examples there of spontaneous cures of cancer, this kind of thing. A patient is diagnosed as having a growth, an abdominal growth. They decide to operate. But the moment they open up, they find that the thing is so extensive that there's no question of any removal of any part. Finding that it is so widely disseminated, the surgeon decides just to sew up immediately and does literally nothing at all. He's just opened the abdominal cavity and then he's immediately closed it up. From that moment, that patient begins to recover. And after a while, there is no trace or evidence whatsoever of the disease. Now, a number of the cases in America went into that group, just a laparotomy and no more. Other cases were those in which patients with this kind of growth and with secondary deposits and so on developed some intercurrent illness, a fever or something like that. And from the moment they had this other illness, the cancerous condition began to clear up. Well, I needn't take your time over that. They'd collected these 244 cases where they were quite satisfied, medical men were quite satisfied that there had been this spontaneous cure in apparently hopeless cases. I think we've got to re-examine that again and find some explanation of it. It surely should open our minds somewhat from an over-dogmatic position. Then I think it's interesting that there is a new view of disease coming in, a new theory as to disease, the whole process of health and disease. We shouldn't be surprised at this. You remember the statement in 1 Corinthians 11 with regard to the communion service, where the apostle says that because some people haven't examined themselves and so on, for this cause many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. The apostle there teaches quite clearly that illness sometimes, not always, but sometimes, has a spiritual cause. For this cause, many are weak and sickly among you. In other words, spiritual conditions can lead to physical diseases and conditions. Well, we always ought to have known that, and we should have given due weight to that. But now, of course, that doesn't present the difficulty it once did. The whole notion of stress and of psychosomatic medicine tallies with this and shows us how observers, quite apart from Christianity, have come to see that we had been sadly neglecting this kind of psychic aspect in the whole notion of disease. We'd been too materialistic and mechanistic in our outlook. The change that any man of my age has observed in medicine in this respect is really quite astounding. I can still remember the early days of Freudianism and psychoanalysis, and it was, of course, the one joke that one could always fall back on when everything else had gone. It was so funny, and the kind of men who, when asked the causes of gastric ulcer, started by saying warrior anxiety, and the way he was ridiculed by the chief and by everybody else. It was all so funny. It was purely a matter of the amount of acid in the stomach and so on, and had there been an injury. You're familiar with all this. Well, now, here is a new view which brings in another aspect. Not only that, we've read from time to time of cases where a patient has suddenly developed, say, diabetes as the result of a shock. I'm familiar with one example of this in my own family, where an aunt of mine who'd been perfectly well. Her eldest son was killed in a very tragic manner, and she promptly developed the symptoms of diabetes and was treated with insulin as long as she lived. Other cases have been reported, and one is hearing about this kind of thing. I think that there have been cases, and indeed others have expressed this, of course, where a cancerous growth seems to have been started by some kind of shock or of disappointment or something like that. Furthermore, there is a tendency today to regard all these diseases not so much in the old local way as in a more systemic or constitutional manner. Is cancer only a local disease, or is it a general condition with local manifestations? Surely the view increasingly is that it's general with local manifestations and not merely a local condition. And there's all this speculation about the role of immunogens and so on. You've been reading some of these learned addresses that have been delivered on this subject, and to me it's all very, very fascinating, because it's all indicative of the fact that people are now realizing that the whole man is involved, and that we mustn't consider only local manifestations, that there are all these other factors. Now, we were familiar in a measure with this years ago. I remember the introduction of the protein shock treatment for rheumatoid arthritis. Well, there in a sense was the application of a similar theory. You were deliberately giving a shock to this patient in order to stimulate a kind of general resistance, which then would look after this particular local condition. You deliberately gave this person this tremendous reaction in order that it might deal with that. I've often told a story which has its amusing element to illustrate this thing. I remember at the close of a service once when I was preaching in a certain place, I happened to notice during the singing of a hymn that a minister in that town whom I'd known for years was more or less being carried in by two people and put to sit in a seat, obviously crippled with rheumatoid arthritis, and they brought him on to me at the end, and he said he wanted to ask me a question, and his question was this. He had been fortunate at last in getting a bed in the Royal Mineral Hospital at Bath, and he wanted to go there, but to his utter discomfiture, he'd received an intimation the day before that he wouldn't be admitted to that bed unless he was vaccinated. And he was in trouble about being vaccinated. He was afraid that in his frail condition that this might kill him and so on. What was my advice? Should he be vaccinated or not? And the answer I gave him was this, that as he was so fortunate in getting a bed in that famous hospital, he should go there at all costs. Then I added as a kind of footnote, I said, yes, and in any case, I said, you know, you never know what good this vaccination may do you. It may very well clear up your whole condition. And we left it at that. I didn't see this man for 6 months. Next time I saw him, he came walking to me perfectly well. I said, well, they obviously have very good treatment in the Royal Mineral Hospital at Bath. He said, I never went there. Well, I said to him, what happened to you? He said, well, as you said, he said, I had such a violent reaction with the vaccination, it seemed to cure me. And it had cured him. Well, now, here is something surely that should have made us think, and think seriously, as to the whole process of health and of disease. Isn't it clear that this is a very delicate and a very sensitive mechanism? There's a balance. There is something in the human body that preserves this extraordinary balance between health and disease. I remember 50 years ago reading a great book bearing the title of Infection and Resistance, and it left a deep impress on my mind. This balance. Now, it seems to me that not in the realm of infection only, but speaking much more generally, in diseases like those to which I've referred, there is this extraordinary balance. There are forces that are disease-producing. They're held in check. And it's obvious that all this is controlled by the nervous system. This must be the controlling element. So that I would come to this conclusion, that disease may be caused by many factors. one of a large number of factors may hit this controlling mechanism and knock out of action temporarily, if you like, the mechanism that preserves health. It may be a shock, it may be an accident, or it may be an infection. It may be one of many, many factors. Surely we must look at it like that. Well then, are we not entitled to look at the other side and to say this, that cures, likewise, may be the result of many, many factors? You have the ordinary means which we use, penicillin, etc., a direct attack on the germs. We still haven't altogether abandoned, have we, the building up of resistance. There was always that element. We used to send TB people to Switzerland and so on. What for? Well, to build up the resistance. We had nothing whereby we could attack the germs directly. So what we did then was to build up the resistance, infection and resistance, this balance. And if you could push up the resistance, down went the infection, and so on. Well, now, that is still there. But not only do we think in terms of the ordinary or the well-recognized and the usual means, I think we've now got to go further. If shock can cause a disease, why can't a corresponding shock on the other side restore the patient to health, stimulate the mechanism on that side, and put an end to the diseased condition? And as I say, there are examples and illustrations being accumulated in the literature, medical literature, which are pointing very strongly in this direction. And what about this whole question of the will to live? I'm suggesting, you see, that we've tended to be too mechanistic in our outlook upon disease. We've tended to forget the patient. We've tended to forget this delicate mechanism. Now, I'm very fond, and I'm becoming aged, you see, and so you indulge in reminiscences, and you'll have to bear with me. But there are certain things which get impressed on one's mind that one never forgets. I often told the story of doing a round one day in Barts with our chief Lord Horder, and we came to the bed of a man, a blacksmith. There he was in the corner, propped up, panting for breath, legs swollen, ascites and all the rest of it. And he had become rambling and delirious. And the two house physicians and myself had come to the conclusion that the man was obviously dying, and we wondered whether he'd last out through the day. However, we came to this man's bed, and we were beginning to talk, and the poor old patient was rambling and kept on muttering something, and he was making the proceedings impossible. So Horder turned to him and said, "What are you saying? What are you saying, my good man?" And the man said, "Can I get up tonight, sir?" And Horder, to our utter astonishment, said, "Yes, certainly." Well, I must have registered something on my face, and so did the house physicians. So Horder drew us all aside and took us to stand before the fire. And he said, "I can see that you all think I've suddenly taken leave of my senses." And we didn't actually say it, but we looked at it. Well, now, he said, "Let me tell you exactly why I told that man that he could get up." He said, "You are all agreed, aren't you, that this man is going to die?" "Yes, sir." He said, "I agree with you. Therefore, let him get up." Why? Well, don't refuse a request from a dying man. If you are sure he's going to die, his getting up can't make any difference. He's going to die in any case, you're sure of it. Well, don't refuse the request of a dying man. So that's my main reason for saying that he can get up. But he said, I have got a second reason. He said, the heart is an extraordinary organ. And when it is sometimes very badly diseased, it can be lazy on top of that. And sometimes you'll find, he said, that a diseased heart can benefit from a little activity. So, as in any case he's going to die and you can't do any harm, let him get up. Let's wait and see what happens. So we got the man up for about 10 minutes. And he got back, and he slept better that night than he'd done for many nights. Well, to cut a long story short, that man so improved that we discharged him, And he'd come up and report every so on, and when I left at the end of 1926, he was still just reporting once every 6 months for us to keep an eye on him. Well, now, what was this factor? What did this? This wasn't a question of the change in the amount of digitalis or anything else. There was this other factor that came in. And I feel that we've not been giving sufficient attention to this. Will you take one other story? This has also impressed me. I used to go and preach in a place every year in the Vale of Glamorgan. I made one of the greatest blunders of my life in a medical sense. I was preaching at this little place, I remember, for the first time in 1928 on a Tuesday night and Wednesday afternoon and evening. And having supper with the old lady with whom I'd put to stay, and she was a real old lady, worthy of the name, quite a tyrant in her local community. And she and I were having a little supper before I went home, and she leaned across the table halfway through and said, "Will you do an old woman a favor?" I said, "Well, if I can, I will. I'd be glad to do so." Well, she said, "Will you come and preach next year at these meetings?" "All right," I said, "I will." We went on eating. After a while, she leaned forward again. She said, "Look here, will you do an old woman another favor?" I said, "Well, it depends what it is." "Oh, it's all right." She said, "You can do it." Well, I said, "What is it?" "Will you promise to come and preach at these meetings as long as we both live?" Well, she'd already told me she was age 79. Her skin was more like parchment than skin. And I, in my cleverness, came to the conclusion that there was no risk at all involved in it. So I entered into the contract. This was 1928. Whether you believe it or not doesn't matter, but I solemnly had to go and preach in that place. It was Llantwit Major. Until 1939, every year. And but for the war and her evacuation to mid-Wales because of the aerodrome, I'd have had to go on until 1942 when she died. But this is the point of this story. I think it was somewhere about 1936. This poor old lady got a terrible attack of bronchitis and bronchopneumonia. There was no penicillin then, you know. The M&B drugs were just coming in. I don't know whether they'd even come in. I can't quite remember the year. She was desperate. Wealthy old lady, day nurses, night nurses, all the relatives. And they were quite convinced, all of them, and the medical men as well, that she was finished. She was dying. One morning, about 3 o'clock in the morning, she suddenly sat up in bed and said, "Give me that calendar, almanac on the wall." And of course they thought this was a part of the delirium. However, she insisted upon having it, and they gave it to her. And she looked at it and turned over a page and looked and turned back and on and on. Well, typical delirium, of course. However, it's all right as long as it amused her. Everything was all right. Suddenly she said to them, "He'll be here in 6 weeks." She'd worked out, you see, the date of my annual visit. And from that moment she began to get well. How do you explain that? It wasn't a case of another example of the thing I remember well, and I'm only reminded of this now, of a very literary-minded student reading out a note to Horder one day, and having with great flourish given the history and the family history and all the rest of it, came to his findings. And his first remark was this. He said, "I noticed that as I approached the bed, the patient looked somewhat apprehensive." "Wait a minute," said Horder. "The fact that a patient looks apprehensive when you approach the bed is not of necessity a sign of disease." Well, I don't think that came in the case of this old lady in Llantwit Major. Well, in other words, do you see, I'm trying to show that there are so many factors that we tend to exclude, which can play upon this delicate mechanism of health and disease. And into this category, I would put faith. Now, faith of any kind, I don't care what kind, if this view is correct, any kind of faith can do it. The Spiritist can do it. We mustn't limit these factors. All this has been a great help to me in my own understanding. I haven't mentioned the people who seem to have a natural gift of healing. I don't understand that. But it's clear to me that as many factors can cause disease, many factors can produce cures. Not only Christian faith, but any kind of faith. Shock, any one of these factors can do it. Very well. So I come to my final conclusions and ask your forgiveness for these rambling remarks. We as Christians must believe in miracles not because of all I've been saying, but because we believe the Bible. Our belief in God should put us into a position where we have no difficulty at all in accepting the miraculous, and that it can happen at any moment in the will and the volition of God. What I've been trying to say this morning is of apologetic value, but it should never be the basis of our faith. For us to say, oh yes, I can believe in miracles now because of the new scientific outlook and because of a new way of looking at health and disease, is to me almost a contradiction of the Christian faith. We believe because we believe the record. But this, I've been putting before you, should be of some apologetic help and value to us, and especially in the ways that I'm going to indicate. I feel that we must be very careful lest we fall into the same error as the Roman Catholic Church fell into over the case of Copernicus and Galileo. They rejected his facts, you remember, because they didn't fit into their theory. We must be very careful that we are not caught at the same point, that we will not recognize facts because our theory makes it impossible. Indeed, I've sometimes had a fear that our dogmatism is far too similar to that of the communists with regard to Lysenko. We mustn't theoretically ban certain findings. We must have an open mind and be ready to receive them and to examine them. So I would go on to say that we must still continue to maintain our healthy, skeptical and critical attitude to everything that is reported to us. But I think we must be critical on all sides, not simply on one. We must criticize the dogmatisms of science. The scientists themselves are doing it, so we mustn't lag behind too much. We must be aware of all these immense possibilities that are opening out. So many of the old established dogmatic positions of the scientists are being queried at the present time, partly as the result of these trips to the moon and so on. Everything is so much bigger, the possibilities. Man really knows so little. Because we have knowledge in a certain segment, we've tended to assume we know it all, but we don't. Probability, remember now, not determinism. But, and to me this is the most important finding of all from the theological standpoint, we must not allow our doctrine to be determined by phenomena. Now this, it seems to me, is the danger. As I told you, that good man at Pittsburgh and others, and there are many today, who seem to be so fascinated by results that they're prepared to abandon what they've always believed. Now, here to me is the real danger, and I hope I've been able to show that there's no need to do that. You see, their argument, more or less, was this kind of argument. Well, now, here are these things that Catherine Kuhlman, for instance, is doing. Here are concrete results. Who am I to stand up against this? Who am I to trust to my thinking? Now, there is the fallacy. They're prepared, as it were, to ordain Catherine Kuhlman, and so on. Now, let me put the argument like this. You do not decide whether it is right for a woman to preach and to be a pastor of a church by phenomena that she can produce. It's the Bible that still determines that. Your doctrine, in every respect, still is determined by the Bible. What about these other things, then, you say? Well, I reply, I'm in no difficulty about them. I don't deny what she reports as facts and others substantiate as facts. I recognize that there are a number of factors that can produce healings. Therefore, that she produces healings doesn't substantiate her claim to be a minister as well as a man, or that I've got to accept all that she teaches about everything. Now, this is what has been happening. Throughout the years, I've known very good people who, because of something they've seen in a Pentecostal meeting, have joined the Pentecostal church. You see why they've done it. Because of this which has happened, they submit to the entire teaching. And there are those who go to Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, for the same reason. My hope is that in what I've put before you, we can be delivered completely from that by seeing that these phenomena can be explained quite simply and adequately in the terms I've suggested to you. And I can accept them. And my position, dogmatically and doctrinally and theologically, is quite undisturbed. I still go to the Bible for my views on all these matters. Now, the Bible itself teaches us to do this. Jannes and Jambres, you remember, could reproduce a great deal of what Moses and Aaron did. Our Lord says in Matthew 7 that there would be people who would come to him and say, Lord, Lord. They'd not only believed in him, but they'd done many mighty works and cast out devils in his name. He doesn't dispute the claim nor the facts, but still he says, I never knew you. Depart from me. All along the Bible tells us to prove and to test and to examine the spirits. The Bible itself teaches us that there are many forces and factors that can produce phenomena and results. Some of them are evil spirits. Well, how do you decide? Well, now then, all I'm saying is the phenomenon doesn't decide. You don't capitulate to the phenomenon. You arrive at your conclusions on other and on biblical grounds. So that miraculous or at any rate supernatural happenings and events do not validate a ministry of necessity, and certainly must never be allowed to determine our point of view. So you may ask me at this point, well, how do you decide in any particular case? And it's extremely difficult. This Catherine Kuhlman is to me one of the most difficult cases of all, because she preaches the Lord Jesus Christ as you and I would do, and she seems to be correct in her doctrine. That's what makes it difficult. There are other elements in her ministry, and I heard her several days on the radio. There are many elements about her ministry about which I would be extremely unhappy. To me, an obvious psychological element, even an assumed voice, and a very artificial one at that, and a great deal of laughter and of joking and of things of that description. And still more basic, this whole question of the teaching of the Bible with regard to the ministry of women. Well, now, however, the comfort I seem to have arrived at in myself is this, that I'm no longer troubled about this, that my decision is still a biblical one and a doctrinal one, and I am not overawed or upset or frightened by the phenomena, and allow the phenomena to shake my whole position. So you have to come back to certain general principles. In the New Testament, and indeed in the Old, you never find miracles announced beforehand. It seems quite clear to me that in all these cases reported in the Scriptures, what happened was that an immediate commission was given to the men or to the men who worked the miracle. Peter and John were the men at the beautiful gate of the temple. Paul were the men at Lystra, and so on. They didn't know they were going to do this. I believe they were given an immediate commission. So they didn't experiment, and were not given any reports of failures in the book of Acts. There's a kind of certainty and assurance and a confidence. And I believe this was the result of the commission that was given to the men concerned, and he knew that it was going to happen. One notices also that the effect of the working of miracles upon the people was to fill them with a sense of awe and of fear at times. They would say, we have seen wonderful things today, or ascribe power to God. Whereas in these other popular healing meetings and so on, there's laughter and jocularity, and they even boast of this. I would say that the Bible teaches that any manifestation of the power of God is awe-inspiring and excludes any spirit of levity, any kind of lightness in the attitude. So you are left with these general considerations. I must say just one other word, as I'm sure I shall be questioned about it, on this meaning of faith. You remember in James 5 and in Mark 11:22 and 24. The prayer of faith shall heal the sick. You remember that. And then there's this other one that people are so troubled by, and I've been questioned about it so constantly. Let me read these words from Mark 11:22 to 24. And Jesus answering saith unto them, Have faith in God. For verily I say unto you, that whosoever shall say unto this mountain, Be thou removed, and be thou cast into the sea, and shall not doubt in his heart, but shall believe that those things which he saith shall come to pass, he shall have whatsoever he saith. Therefore I say unto you, what things soever ye desire when ye pray, believe that ye receive them, and ye shall have them. Now we've all known people who've been trying to work themselves up into this faith. That, I believe, is the fallacy. I believe that faith referred to there as the prayer of faith in James 5 is again a given faith. I put it into the same category as the commission that was given to the apostles and others who, in my opinion, have worked miracles since the day of the apostles. Not experimentation, not announcement on Sunday there's going to be a healing meeting on Thursday. You can't do that because you don't know. This is given, and the prayer of faith is given. You can't work it up. You either have it or you haven't got it. And so it depends upon your general spirituality and your general belief and faith in God. My final word is one of warning. We all must have had people coming to us who have been healed, as they claim, in a spiritist meeting, or as the result of the activity of a spiritist spiritual healing. Now, here I suggest that it is very wrong or foolish, more or less, to tell the person in front of you that he hasn't been healed. I think we've had a tendency to do that at times. I trust it's clear that they can do this. But I believe at this point we've got to warn these people. We mustn't try to make them ill again in order to keep our doctrine correct. But what we must do is to tell them that having thus submitted to a power that we believe originates in evil spirits, they have to be very careful that the evil spirits do not take advantage of this. Now, Kurt Koch, in his big book, Christian Counseling and the Occult, constantly makes this point, and it's an obvious one. If at any time you uncritically yield yourself to an unseen power, you're asking for trouble. You see, the Bible tells us to prove them and to test them. It recognizes their reality and their influence and their power. We have underestimated, it seems to me, tragically, as evangelicals, the power of evil spirits. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. We've got to realize this, and we've got to warn these people, therefore, that having once yielded themselves for the purposes of health, they may be more liable to subsequent onslaughts on the part of such influences and powers. So I would conclude by saying this: we must continue to use the means as usual. God's customary way of dealing with disease is through these means and methods. Abilities is given to men, drugs that is put in such profusion in nature, and so on. But, in addition, we must remember this other factor, and not be surprised at it, indeed to be expectant, not to be disturbed in our theology, not to abandon our biblical positions because of phenomena, but to try and to test them all. Explain them in these ways, as we are enabled now to do, more easily perhaps than before, but still to believe that with God all things are possible, that God can work miracles today as he has done in past ages, and especially as the days are darkening and the forces of evil seem to be coming out in an unusually aggressive and potent manner, we must not exclude dogmatically, in the way we've often tended to do, the equally positive manifestation and demonstration of the power of God to heal diseases or to do anything that he wills and chooses to do. Well, sir, there are some of these thoughts that have resulted from being confronted by this problem anew and afresh some 2 years ago.
We do hope that you've been helped by the preaching of Dr. Martyn Lloyd-Jones. All of the sermons contained within the MLJ Trust audio library are now available for free download. You may share the sermons or broadcast them. However, because of international copyright, please be advised that we are asking first that these sermons never be offered for sale by a third party. And second, that these sermons will not be edited in any way for length or to use as audio clips. You can find our contact information on our website at mljtrust.org. That's mljtrust.org.